Kentucky kind of was the stereotypic brother against brother.
People want to change now.
The election in 1899 was very ugly.
He wasn't like your typical Kentucky politician.
He could have been considered a bully. As they approached the building, there was a shot.
Divided the people of Kentucky again for a long period of time and put them on a detour away from progressivism.
The 1890s were really a very tough time for a lot of people.
Kentucky politics in the 1890s was a very changing and moving kind of picture because the Democratic Party had been dominant since the Civil War for the last 30 years. They'd won elections by over 60% of the vote each election. One time the Kentucky legislature was 128 Democrat and 10 Republican. So it had been a dominant Democratic Party, but the party was split by factionalism. As parties that are dominant often are, there's two factions. One was a kind of conservative faction, one was a more liberal faction. So it had won elections, but it was always split, so it was almost like a three-party system in the state.
Government was at the local level, pretty much county-based, and eventually there were 120 counties in Kentucky, so there's a lot of opportunities for corruption and so forth, and deal making.
Politics was very combative, a lot of shenanigans going on, a lot of cheating, vote buying, and very, very partisan political and legal events going on at that time too.
You had a bit of large political lobbies, mainly the Louisville and Nashville Railroad was the main one, which had everybody on its payroll basically. Every county that it went through had an attorney that was on its payroll. Every legislator in the counties that it traveled through was on the payroll of the LNN just about. So it had a real powerful influence in Kentucky politics. They said that nobody could pass a bill without the approval of the LNN.
For Goebel especially, it was important for him because as a lawyer, he was working in railroad and corporate law.
Goebel represented people who were injured in railroad accidents. He fought for low wage, the laborers for railroads who were not paid that much, and they worked long hours and so forth.
There was a strike against the L&N Railroad in the 1890s, and about 10% of the workers were laid off or fired, and 1,400 employees of the railroad protested, went out in public, with the signs and protesting, and Goebel defended those people against the railroad, and because of his long history of fighting the railroad, those were the railroads became, especially the L&N, became his enemy. Kentucky kind of was the stereotypic brother against brother. There were a lot of families that had sons or fathers that fought for the North and some that fought for the South, so it really was a divided state.
People want to change now, want to change. And there's change taking place anyway with the populists and these two Democratic factions and the Republican Party coming stronger and stronger. So in that atmosphere, Goebel comes to the forefront.
Goebel was actually born in the North. He was born in Pennsylvania and in 1856, and then his father was a Union soldier during the war, and then after the war they moved to Kentucky, and those play a big part. His parents were immigrants, they were German, and his being from the North, his parents being immigrants, and his father fighting for the Union made him suspect by a lot of people, especially Southern sympathizers, as time went on in the 19th century. He did get a law degree from Cincinnati Law School in the 1870s.
And then he attracted the attention of some very prominent politicians, probably the two most prominent politicians in Northern Kentucky's ever had, in fact. One of them was John W. Stevenson, who was a United States Senator, was the governor of Kentucky, and later president of the American Bar Association. And then John G. Carlisle, who was also a United States Senator and Secretary of the Treasury in the United States. These are two very important people. And Goebel studies under one, under Stevenson, and becomes a law partner of the other. They're very establishment people. He breaks with both of them eventually because they're establishment and he's anti-establishment. But he makes they get him started. And once he gets started, that's the way you start out in politics. You get to start, then you're on your own. they got him started, and he used their basis and their support to go on from there.
He really wasn't a good speaker. He wasn't charismatic in any way. He was very quiet, he was very private, and he was kind of depending on what you thought about him, he could have been considered a bully. A lot of people thought that he was power hungry. Other people took him to be a friend of the common man because he did take on these cases where workers for the railroads, he was trying to improve the workers' conditions. He also supported advanced civil rights for women and blacks. So these were very progressive ideas in the 19th century. He was very good at organizing. Even though his personality may not have been that warm and fuzzy, he was very good at getting support.
Goebel was state senator in 1887. 8 years later, he was senator pro tem, the head of the Senate, so he was rising rapidly. Then he almost fell to the end, to the bottom, because of the Sanford assassination as it took place in northern Kentucky. Goebel was a rival of this man, John Sanford, who was another Democrat. Sanford represented the old school Democrats, Goebel the new school Democrats. Sanford represented the Carlyles and the Stevensons. Goebel had broken with them and moved on. And they were arguing over a lot of things in northern Kentucky, including the toll road issue. Toll roads at that time were often operated by private industry. You had to move from place to place and pay the tolls. Also bridges and things like that. There were several things they argued about. But John Sanford and Goebel were bitter enemies, bitter factional enemies. Goebel even bought a newspaper, and in that newspaper he then used the words, he referred to Sanford as Gonorrhea John. Well, Sanford was not amused by this.
And they seemed to just kind of meet by accident at the First National Bank, which was located in the middle of the block on the west side of Madison, the middle of the 500 block of Madison at the time.
Each man has his right hand in his pocket, which is odd, and they shake hands. Apparently the right hand was around a pistol. And they shake hands, and then Sanford says to Goebel, I assume that you're the author of that article. And Goebel says, I am. And then as quickly as 2 snaps of a finger, they draw their pistols at point blank range, closer than we are, and they fire. In fact, one of the bystanders had powder burns he was so close. Goebel had a bullet hole in his coat from Sanford's gun.
But Goebel killed Sanford, shot to the forehead.
And Goebel seemed to be an outcast in his party, if he calls that. He made his amends. He built the bridges back that he burned. He made gained the support again. Became the big man in Kentucky politics in Kenton County, and Kenton King again was ruling Kentucky.
He was in the state Senate when he was nominated for governor in 1899. The big controversy that started right before the election, he pushed through some legislation. It's called the Goebel election law, where a committee was formed, an election committee was formed that would vet any disputed elections, gubernatorial elections. So that is kind of ironic considering what happened later on in the election.
Goebel was a strange politician. Politicians are usually backslapping, baby kissing, shaking hands, loving people. Goebel was cold and aloof. He was one of the people who knew him and followed him on the campaign trail said he never saw a man who so closely suggested the reptilian as Goebel did, which is not a good thing you want to have said about you if you're a politician, really.
He wasn't like your typical Kentucky politician, go out before the people and give speeches, or fancy speeches or kind of speech making that's Kentucky's famous for. He was a backroom fellow. Now, what he did in the back rooms with his deals, with his political deal making, was not necessarily bad, but it was very easy to look at it as corruption, operating behind the scenes. But that's what he was good at. He's a great organizer and great at making deals.
Boss, a political boss, one of the first ones in Kentucky politics, a man who he would make deals to get the things he wanted. He couldn't go out and give the fiery speech that inspired people to go out and do things. He'd go work behind the scenes, and that way he was a different kind of politician. That worked against him too, because people weren't used to that. But he also had issues that were the issues that people wanted to hear about. And he was a man for the people in that sense, so he was beginning a new politician that way as well, not just in his form, but in his functions and what he was believing in. And so he became a very popular politician, not because of what he did on the stump as a political speaker, more what he did as what he said on the stump, what he argued, what he stood for, what he wanted. Goebel and the L&N hated each other, basically. That's the simplest way to say it. The Louisville-Nashville Railroad was the biggest monopoly in Kentucky, the biggest corporation in the state, and it governed the state's politics, really. And Goebel saw this. Also, he probably was a rising politician in northern Kentucky. He supported a lot of people who had claims against the L&N. He made a lot of money against the L&N Railroad as a lawyer, supporting claims against them. So they didn't like him for that reason. He didn't like them for other reasons as well. And so he became a very advocate of stricter controls on this great monopoly, this great power in Kentucky politics. And of course the L&N didn't like this at all either, so they eventually purchased a whole newspaper to publish stories against Goebel when he's running for governor. And Goebel says the same thing against the L&N when he's running for governor in his first speech. He says, "I fear no foe," and he's including the L&N Railroad, and he's very definite about that. He's very much opposed to the L&N.
It really could almost be considered political suicide because the railroads were extremely powerful, and it was extremely important because the coal mines were working in eastern Kentucky, and that was the only way you could get the coal out was through the railroads. Of course, transporting goods from above the Ohio River down through Kentucky to Tennessee or to ports to areas onto the deeper south. The railroads were extremely important, and it shows the level of either political astuteness on his part in terms of helping in terms of his political career, because he knew that the everyday worker would support him in his fight against the railroads. But it was also, I think, very dangerous. The election in 1899 was very ugly. There were accusations of cheating on both sides. Most of the discussion about the controversy of the election was that there was vote buying. The L&N Railroad was a big supporter of Taylor, and so there were rumors or questions of their involvement. There were some questions of bullying, trying to use violence to get people to vote one way or the other. So it was that kind of shenanigans that were going on. The election commission that Goebel helped form actually said that the Republican candidate, William Taylor, was the winner of the election. But the democratically held legislature decided to investigate because there were so many allegations of cheating.
The Election Commission looks at the returns. These have been all appointed by Goebel. These men were all Democrats. They were all supportive of Goebel. Everybody expected the Election Commission to throw out enough votes themselves and say Goebel had been elected. But to the surprise of everybody, the Election Commission that Goebel had set up himself said that Taylor had won by a 2-to-1 vote. They decided in favor of Taylor. Said that his enemies said that Goebel had overlooked only one thing in his search for office. He overlooked the possibility that men might be honest. That these men had voted 2-to-1 for the. So that was the first step in the election, and that said that Goebel was not elected, and Taylor was. The next step was then to examine the ballots.
The committee was meeting here in the old Capitol. Goebel was walking up the front sidewalk with two of his friends, co-workers.
It's a cold day. Snow, little bits of snow on the ground. Goebel's in front of him is one of his aides. Behind him is one of his aides. It seems to be an unexpectedly clear day, unexpectedly clear place around him.
And as they approached the building, there was a shot.
Goebel crumbles to the ground, and 5 other shots ring out. Somebody rushes up to Goebel and says, "I think they've killed you, Goebel," and Goebel says, "I think they have."
And it is believed that the shot came from the Secretary of State's office, which was in the annex.
The bullet hole went through his coat here. You can see it in the History Center in Frankfurt. Came through his lung, punctured his lung, out the other side of the body.
Was taken to the Capital City Hotel, where he was treated by multiple doctors. He was there, I think for 3 or 4 days. In the meantime, Governor Taylor William Taylor was inaugurated, sworn in as governor. He decided that things were getting a little out of hand, and he called in the militia. So there were all of these Republicans on one side with the governor and the militia, and then the Democrats were saying, no, 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 Goebel won this election, and so they brought in their militia. So things got really heated with a lot of hot-headedness going on. The legislature, or the special committee, decided that Goebel actually won the election, and he was sworn in on his deathbed. The only official act that he did was to send the militia home to try to dissipate some of the tension. He died, and his lieutenant governor, J.C.W. Beckham, was sworn in as governor. Between Taylor being sworn in and Goebel, when he was sworn in before he died, that period, there were 2 governments here, the Republican government and the Democratic government.
So you have now 2 governors of Kentucky, and each calls out their own friendly militia force. So you have 2 militia forces in the state capitol facing each other across the streets from Frankfort, across Broadway, 2 militia forces. And a spark could have set off another civil war, this time around party lines rather than along north and south lines.
The Republicans had brought in folks from eastern Kentucky, as well as having the militia, and these folks from eastern Kentucky were seen as a real threat, and that's why there was almost like a mini civil war during that time period, because things were just so heated and very, very partisan.
Who killed William Goebel is a question that still remains. Who killed William Goebel?
The LNN, of course, was also suspected as being behind the assassination. There were other theories that it was a salesman, someone who was mentally unbalanced. Actually, one of the defendants was considered to have some mental deficiencies, and that's how he was convinced to become part of this conspiracy.
20 people were indicted, 6 people went to trial. 3 people were eventually convicted.
Caleb Pars from Knox County, I think James Hard from Clay County, and Henry Outsey from Campbell County. And it was always assumed that the shot came from Caleb Pars' office, but whether he was directly involved or indirectly involved in any way could not be proven. It was all kind of mysterious. There were no witnesses. And Caleb Pars' first trial was, in that trial he was convicted, but even the Democratic newspapers and the Democrats, the Democratic newspapers, whoever were in the courtroom watching it, thought it was a miscarriage of justice. It was kind of rigged. It was rigged. The presiding judge even, he would fine defense people defending Caleb if they did certain things. He would fine them, instead of letting them talk ahead.
They all served time, but they were all pardoned. And I think even more interesting is that Caleb Powers, after he got out of prison, ran for the U.S. Senate and was elected, which I think says a lot about Kentucky politics at the time, that even being tainted with the brush of assassinating a sitting governor didn't hurt his political career at all.
The trials were not conducted fairly.
People deliberately perjured themselves. Lawyers would coax their witnesses, and things that you would see now would just definitely not be allowed at all. There were probably bribes that were passed. There were very, very partisan judges and juries in all of these trials. Even appeal courts, the judges were very partisan.
But then they went to the state's highest court, which at that time happened to be Republican. The Republican court was as equally as partisan as the Democratic juries had been, and they overturned all the convictions.
And I think that's probably the reason we don't know who actually did, whether it was Caleb Powers or one of the other 2 men. No one told the truth, or very few. I'll say very few people told the truth. And so it was just a circus.
So these 3 men went through 7 trials over a period of 7 years. But these trials are going on, and so you have people being convicted and overturned, and being convicted and overturned. Caleb Powers goes through 4 trials eventually. Finally, all 3 men are pardoned by either Democrat or Republican governors. and all the indictments are thrown out for the other people like Governor Taylor, so he can come back into the state safely. Remember, this is a time when Kentucky is a very violent state. Its image is one of violence. The feuds had been taking place before that. Now Goebel's assassination takes place. And these trials then draw out for the next 7 years. So that's in the front page news of the United States every year or so. There's another story about the Goebel assassination. Same time the Black Patch War is going on in western Kentucky, and there's violence there. It's one of the biggest mass violence of American history. So all these things are going on. And Kentucky's getting a very violent image. It hurts the state's image overall, really. It hurts the state's development overall. So, you know, in a sense, though, it says the Democrats were saying, you killed our governor. Republicans are saying, you stole our election. It gives a sense of why we have such partisan feelings in Kentucky still yet.
There's a lot of debate about how Kentucky would have turned out if Goebel had not been assassinated. Some folks think that the progressive movement died with him, that Kentucky went back in time in the way they think about things and the way they do things.
Yes, his being assassinated kind of divided the people of Kentucky again for a long period of time, and kind of put them on a detour away from progressivism to some degree. And
there are others that think that that's not really the case, because there were progressive legislations, laws that were passed, and there were reforms made. And it's possible that once he became governor, maybe he would have stopped caring about the common man and just focused on his power. So it really is kind of hard to say one way or the other whether Kentucky would have been better or worse if he had lived and served out his term as governor.
Well, I argue in my book that Goebel was a progressive politician. He was a man who believed in things before a lot of people other did. He believed in women's suffrage. He believed more in black rights than a lot of people in his era did. But also, he was a political boss, and in that sense he was both a modern and a past politician too. But had he become governor, he probably would have been pretty progressive in the state. But at the same time, those people who followed him became very progressive because the era was becoming that way. The times were changing. He represented the times that were changing, but so did these other later politicians. So in a sense, I don't know that things would have changed that much, but he may have changed earlier, quicker. And Goebel was seen certainly as a threat to the establishment, and that's maybe one of the reasons he was shot. I've studied it. I found people who saying that they killed Goebel. Found about a dozen people said they killed Goebel on their deathbeds, usually when it's safe. And you know, because at that time it was very popular to say you killed Goebel if you're a Republican in Eastern Kentucky, because they hated Goebel, and Goebel had been viewed as a villain and a man worthy of killing. So maybe one of those people was telling the truth. I don't know, but I doubt that they were. They're probably just seeking some notoriety at the end of their lives. But there could be a person out there who wandered around for years and years and knowing that he had killed William Goebel and nobody knew it except him. If all the people who said they'd killed Goebel had lined up, and they'd been like a firing squad shooting at him though. But the Goebel's assassin, the question is, who killed William Goebel? We don't know, nor may we ever know who killed him, unless new evidence is uncovered.
There was a poem written in 1902 by a man named James H. Mulligan. It's called In Kentucky, and a lot of people are familiar with it because of the last stanza. And I think this really sums up Kentucky politics, both in the 19th century and probably now in the 21st century as well. It says, "The songbirds are the sweetest in Kentucky. The thoroughbreds are fleetest in Kentucky. Mountains tower proudest, thunder peals the loudest, the landscape is the grandest, and politics the damnedest in Kentucky."